The air over Dayton, Ohio was heavy with a damp chill that seeped into bones and refused to leave. Parents stood clustered outside St. Mark's Baptist Church that morning in October 2005, their breath visible in the cold as they shuffled their feet on the wet pavement. The church was a solid red brick structure that had served the neighborhood for decades, and its front steps were worn by generations of Sunday shoes. The old bell clanged with a dull echo that morning, signaling the end of Sunday school. Usually this was the moment when the door swung open and children burst out laughing, their voices scattering like startled birds. But this time the door stayed closed too long. Parents exchanged uneasy glances, calling out their kids' names with forced cheerfulness that cracked at the edges. The smell of wet leaves and car exhaust filled the air as the seconds crawled past. A mother pulled her cardigan tight and squinted at the window. Nothing moved inside. Inside the dim basement of the church, police officers later picked through discarded crayons and scraps of construction paper left behind by the missing 6 children. A single crayon drawing lay on the table, smeared but legible. 6 small stick figures held hands in a circle, their heads marked with childish initials. Above them, in shaky black letters, was the word "Goodbye." The police chief squatted by the table, exhaling slowly as he took in the meaning. He felt something curdle in his stomach. Outside, parents cried out in panic as the first uniformed officers sealed the church doors with yellow tape. Patrol cars blocked the narrow street, and a dozen neighbors stood in clusters, arms folded, murmuring prayers and curses in equal measure. A father slammed his fist against the hood of his car, leaving a dent. The gray sky pressed down over everyone. The pastor insisted he had locked the side exit by mistake that morning. He stood pale and trembling as he spoke to the police, his voice hitching. He had meant to keep the children from wandering into the parking lot. That explanation sat like a stone in the middle of the investigation. The side door had been jammed shut for hours before anyone noticed, delaying any search of the wooded path behind the church. Officers found muddy footprints near that door later, but by then it was too late. The search dogs lost the scent within minutes on the wet autumn ground. Helicopters thundered overhead, their spotlights sweeping dark treetops. A news van set up across the street, its bright lights making the scene look even colder. Word spread in Dayton like fire through dry grass. In hours, the neighborhood was flooded with volunteers carrying flashlights and shouting the children's names. Parents from other schools joined in, stomping through the underbrush behind the church, tearing at brambles slipping in wet leaves. Their voices echoed in the trees. Police command tents appeared on the lawn radios, crackling with static and clipped orders. No one wanted to say the word abduction out loud. It hung there, unspoken, sour and heavy. Children were pulled from school early that day. Doors were locked and blinds drawn. An old woman stood at her fence, clutching her rosary so hard her knuckles were white. By evening, the candlelight vigil had started, clustered around the old oak on the church lawn. Parents wrapped in blankets leaned into each other, sobbing as a preacher read psalms over the hush of the gathered crowd. Wax dripped onto the grass in pale puddles. Nearby, a circle of teens smoked in silence, eyes wet watching the vigil from the shadows. Reporters whispered urgently into cameras, their voices hushed but eager. Police lights rotated across the damp street in red and blue, reflecting in puddles like blood in water. Somewhere in the dark, a dog barked, and someone let out a low, keening wail. The 6 missing children were all local. Their names were spoken with trembling lips on the evening news. 2 brothers, Jacob and Levi Hart, both with big ears and quick laughs. Emily Donnelly with her braids and crooked teeth. Little Nathaniel Wells, who liked to wear his dad's old baseball cap. Julia Ramirez, who read above her grade level and wrote stories in the margins of her notebooks. Tyler King, the youngest, who was afraid of the dark. They were good kids, everyone insisted, smart and kind, part of the small world that centered around St. Mark's Baptist Church. Their photos began appearing taped to telephone poles and store windows. Missing in bold black letters, faces too young to be lost. As the hours turned into days, the church itself became a place of whispered suspicion and guilt. People gathered in small knots after services, avoiding the basement steps, staring at the stained glass windows as if they hid answers. The pastor, a man in his 60s with watery blue eyes, offered long, weeping prayers from the pulpit, begging forgiveness for whatever had happened on his watch. His voice cracked and broke as he asked God to bring the children home, but there was no comfort in the words. Parents sat in the pews, rigid, their eyes glassy, clutching each other's hands. A baby wailed somewhere in the back, and no one hushed it. Within a week, the first out-of-town reporters arrived, setting up tents in the church parking lot and interviewing distraught parents in their kitchens. The sheriff called in extra deputies to control traffic around the building. Helicopters thudded overhead at dawn and dusk, rattling window panes. Search parties dwindled as the weather turned colder, the leaves rotting underfoot. Volunteers found nothing but deer bones and old beer cans in the woods. Police began interviewing known offenders in the area, but no one was arrested. The case grew wider, more desperate. The fear spread like oil on water. Parents looked at one another with suspicion in grocery store aisles, their carts half full. The national news picked it up at 10 days out, showing slow zooms of the church and the crayon drawing left behind. A special segment ran at 6 o'clock. A young mother with tears streaking mascara down her face begged the camera for whoever took them to please let them go. She collapsed, sobbing into her husband's chest. He patted her back, eyes glazed. The anchor nodded gravely, reading names from a teleprompter. The broadcast ended with a somber hymn played over the image of 6 smiling school photos arranged like a memorial. The screen faded to black. By 2 weeks in, the investigation hit its first official wall. The police chief held a press conference on the courthouse steps, face pale and tight. He said the department was pursuing every lead and asked the public to stay vigilant. Questions from reporters flew like angry birds. Was it an abduction ring? Was it someone local? Was it someone trusted? Were there any suspects at all? He gave only carefully worded non-answers. The crowd booed when he finished. He hurried down the steps, refusing interviews. The families stood off to the side, hollow-eyed. One mother fainted and had to be caught by her sister. The autumn deepened into bitter cold. Halloween passed with porches darkened, pumpkins left uncarved. Few children trick-or-treated. Parents walked their kids to school in silence. Teachers read books and flat voices watching the door. Church attendance dropped to half its usual number. The basement room was sealed to crayons and papers boxed up for evidence. A windstorm knocked out power for hours one night, and the town huddled in cold houses listening to wind howl down empty streets. Someone spray-painted a question on the side of the church, "Where are they?" The pastor had it scrubbed off at dawn, but people had already seen. This was how Dayton would remember that October. Not as the month the leaves turned gold or the air filled with chimney smoke, but as the month 6 children went to Sunday school and never came out. The month the word missing stopped meaning lost and started meaning gone forever. It was a word they would repeat over and over for years. It would linger in the pews in the schools, in the quiet streets and damp basements. It was the word they would carve in their hearts like a warning. It was the word that would shape everything that followed. The shock of that October disappearance spread through Dayton with a cold, unstoppable momentum, hollowing out the normal rhythms of life and replacing them with something raw and fearful. School buses rattled down half-empty roads, as parents insisted on driving their children themselves, refusing to let them wait alone in the chilly morning dark. Teachers tried to keep classes on track, but often stopped mid-sentence, staring out windows that looked onto foggy fields and leaf-clogged drains. Stores posted signs offering discounts to volunteers who helped with search parties. The local coffee shop put up missing posters in every window and refused to play music, keeping the mood hushed and mournful. Conversations in line at the register turned to rumors and frantic speculation, voices low but urgent. Children asked why they could not go outside to play, and parents stumbled for words. The normal shouts of tag and laughter at recess turned into silence as teachers held them inside, watching the doors with tired eyes. Police cruisers became a constant sight on suburban streets, moving at crawl speeds as officers peered between houses and into backyards, waving away stray dogs and stepping over rotting piles of leaves. They knocked on every door within a 5-mile radius of the church, asking the same tired questions over and over. Did you see a white van? Did you notice anyone new in the neighborhood? Did you hear anything late that night? They kept clipboards close to their chests, writing notes with gloved fingers that trembled in the cold. The police chief gave another press conference this time, standing in front of a wall of uniformed officers. His voice was flat and exhausted as he pleaded for anyone with information to come forward. No questions were allowed at the end. Cameras snapped photos of parents standing just beyond the police line, faces drawn, tight eyes sunken with grief and fury that had nowhere to go. Rumors fed on the uncertainty like mold in a damp cellar, spreading until every conversation in town seemed tainted. People whispered about a stranger seen watching the playground a week before. Others claimed they had seen a man in a baseball cap ushering kids toward a white van in the church lot, though that witness soon recanted, saying police had twisted the words. That retraction caused more outrage than relief, and the boy's family was forced to leave town, their tires slashed one night in silent warning. A store clerk said she saw a couple arguing about leaving town suddenly, which turned out to be a divorce filing, but the damage was done. Even old friends found themselves glaring at one another over fences and hedges. Neighborhood barbecues were canceled. Book clubs went silent. Dayton felt like a town at war with itself, the enemy unseen but everywhere. As October deepened into November, the fear curdled into something sour and angry. A mother slapped a reporter's microphone out of her face in the grocery store, screaming that they were vultures feeding on her pain. The footage aired on the local news that night with a voiceover about tensions running high. One father punched a man at a town meeting after accusations were thrown that one of the mothers had not cried enough on television, calling her cold and suspicious. The police were called in to break it up, pulling people apart as they shouted insults that could never be taken back. Pastors from other churches tried to mediate meetings in school gyms, asking people to pray for the missing, but the prayers forced the words dry in everyone's mouth. A town that prided itself on community found itself splintering, the fractures showing in every handshake and forced smile. Volunteer search parties dwindled as the weather worsened, the ground freezing solid, and the wind cutting through jackets no matter how many layers were worn. The forests behind the church turned from colorful tapestries to a desolate mess of bare branches and mud. Searchers lost boots in the swampy ground or came back with torn clothes and empty eyes. When a volunteer tripped and broke an ankle deep in the woods, the sheriff ordered a halt to the untrained efforts, citing safety concerns. The family members who kept pushing anyway found themselves alone in the trees, their flashlights bobbing like distant fireflies as they shouted names into the freezing air that refused to answer. Their voices cracked and bled into sobs. At the same time, the official investigation ran in frantic circles. The single security camera at the gas station on the corner was found to have corrupted footage from that day, a technological failure that no technician could explain. The pastor continued to insist that he had locked the side door by accident, his hands trembling as he signed another police statement. That door remained a symbol of failure, the place where they lost precious hours at the start. Police brought in sniffer dogs from 3 counties over, but the scent trails evaporated into wet leaves and wind. Tips flooded in, most of them cruel hoaxes or the product of fevered imaginations. A psychic from Cincinnati offered her services, but the families refused. They had no interest in false hope. School counselors were called in to help students cope with the fear, leading hushed discussions in decorated classrooms that felt too bright and happy for the subject matter. Children asked if the missing would come home before Christmas. Teachers forced smiles and said they hoped so, though their eyes betrayed the truth. Parents stood awkwardly at pickup, scanning the sidewalk for anyone unfamiliar, refusing to let their children linger to chat. The local newspaper ran editorials begging people to stay calm and not destroy the fabric of the town with suspicion. Letters to the editor poured in arguing about who was to blame, accusing the police of incompetence, the pastor of negligence, the parents of secrecy. It was grief turned toxic, and there was no cure. Meanwhile, the town's traditions fell apart in slow motion. The Fall Harvest Festival was canceled for the first time in decades, leaving the fairgrounds empty and silent, the Ferris wheel rusting in place. The annual turkey drive for the food pantry saw a record low in donations as people hoarded supplies and kept to themselves. The church held services in half-filled pews, the sermons shorter, the prayers more desperate. The pastor, aged 10 years and a month, his hair turning fully white, his voice cracking every time he mentioned the lost children. Candles flickered on the altar, casting long shadows against stained glass that now seemed to depict only tragedy. As Thanksgiving approached, families prepared small, quiet meals without visitors. Tables were set for fewer people. The missing children's places were left empty, haunting every prayer of gratitude. Neighbors who used to trade pies over fences now kept their shades drawn. Carols were not practiced at the school, the music teacher deciding it was too raw, too painful to try. The season's first snowfall was met not with wonder, but with a grim acceptance that the search would have to be suspended until spring. Police quietly shifted resources to other cases. Volunteers put away their maps and flashlights with trembling hands. Dayton had gone from a place of laughter and shared grief to one of suspicion and anger. What started as panic had become something colder, more permanent. Trust felt like a luxury no one could afford. The town learned to avoid eye contact, to lower voices, to cross streets rather than meet neighbors face to face. It was as though the very air held the memory of what happened, refusing to let anyone forget. 6 children had vanished, and in their absence something dark had taken root. By the time winter settled in with icy finality, there was nothing left to do but wait. Police files grew thick and dusty. Search maps yellowed on walls. Candles burned low in windows, guttering in the drafts of old houses. Flyers, with 6 bright faces, faded in the sun and rain. Parents clutched them to chests and cried in silence because there were no words left. Dayton had been transformed, permanently altered. The town was no longer simply afraid, it was broken. By December, the grim reality of the situation had settled into every crack of Dayton like frost that refused to melt. The families continued to gather in living rooms cluttered with boxes of flyers and stacks of police reports they had demanded through legal channels, trying to find the detail someone must have missed. A father sat up at night with a mug of black coffee, gone cold eyes, scanning photocopies of interviews where neighbors contradicted themselves. A mother highlighted every mention of the side door in police statements, going over it until the words blurred on the page. Their Christmas trees went undecorated or stood in corners with half-hung strings of lights that no one bothered to plug in. When neighbors tried to deliver plates of cookies or casseroles, the doors opened only wide enough for a polite thank you, before shutting again, the polite gestures no match for the chasm that had formed between families and the rest of the town. The police department tried to maintain the appearance of progress, holding meetings in the cramped conference room where maps of the surrounding county were pinned to corkboards in chaotic layers. Officers shuffled their feet as the chief read out the latest tips with weary resignation. Most were repeats from the early days, calls about suspicious vans or distant relatives who might have taken the children out of jealousy or spite. A few tips were downright cruel anonymous calls describing burial sites and places already searched, or providing tauntingly fake coordinates. One by one, these leads were closed with red lines through their case numbers and boxed away in files. In the corner of the room sat the drawing found in the basement in a plastic evidence sleeve that had yellowed at the edges. No one could bring themselves to throw it away, but no one knew what to do with it either. The investigation ground forward with the same determination as the first snows, relentless but lacking any warmth. The lead detective who had spoken so confidently at the first press conferences began missing meetings. His voicemail filled with calls from frantic family members he had stopped returning. Word spread among the families that he had been suspended for falsifying a witness statement in another case years earlier, and though the department insisted it was unrelated, it cracked the thin layer of trust that remained. Parents sat at the town hall demanding answers, only to be met with practiced apologies and assurances that all cases received the same attention. A mother stood up and listed every time the department had promised to follow a lead, each one dismissed as unsubstantiated. Her voice broke when she asked why no one seemed to care anymore. The sheriff just lowered his eyes and told her he understood her pain. By late January, the flyers were tattered and faded on storefronts, the tape losing its grip in the damp. Some shop owners quietly removed them in the night, too tired of the constant reminder of what had been lost. Others left them up until the paper crumbled, refusing to erase the memory, even as it made customers uncomfortable. Schools resumed normal schedules, though no one called it normal out loud. Teachers avoided the topic unless asked directly, then chose careful phrases about hope and prayers. Children who asked too many questions were told to focus on their work. In playgrounds that once echoed with shrieking laughter, the swing swayed empty in the wind. Parents sat in idling cars watching the gates with engines running, waving stiffly at neighbors they used to gossip with over coffee. When February came, the cold snapped hard and unforgiving, locking the earth in ice so thick the searchers stopped even pretending they would go back out. Dogs that had sniffed for clues now slept by heaters in their handlers' offices, noses twitching in dreams. Police records grew heavier as they added interviews with Newtown transplants who had no memory of the early days of panic. A detective read them with a sigh, knowing nothing useful would be found. The case was no longer urgent. It was officially considered cold, even if no one used that word in front of the families. Meetings were cut short with vague promises about next steps. Patrols were reduced. The incident command post at the church was packed away in a storage unit where it gathered dust beside folding chairs and rusting lanterns. In homes where 6 bedrooms stood empty or had been converted into quiet shrines, families marked anniversaries that felt like funerals without graves. Some lit candles. Others sat in darkened rooms with the TV off the silence, pressing in on all sides. They tried to speak to each other, but the words came out wrong. Fathers snapped at mothers for crying too loudly. Siblings slammed doors and refused to come down for dinner. Grandparents mailed cards that went unopened. Friends from other towns visited less and less, not knowing what to say or fearing they would be asked for help they could not give. The social worker assigned to the case visited regularly, at first offering group therapy sessions no one attended. Eventually, she stopped calling. Rumors about who was responsible never really died, they just changed shape. Some insisted it had to be someone local who knew the church, lay out the schedule, the hiding places in the woods. Others whispered about outsiders, human traffickers, or a traveling preacher who had vanished around the same time. There was no evidence for any theory, but each one offered a certain cold comfort, a way to pretend there was an answer somewhere that made the sense of the senseless. The pastor resigned that spring, citing health reasons, and left town under a cloud of accusations no one could prove, but everyone repeated. The new pastor avoided mentioning the missing in sermons except for the rare memorial service that drew more reporters than parishioners. By the time summer rolled around, the families still living in Dayton passed each other on the street, like strangers, eyes downcast, unable to decide if they should hug or turn away. Some moved away quietly, leaving for new jobs or to be closer to relatives who promised fresh starts. Others stayed rooted in place by memories they refused to abandon. Yards became overgrown. Fences sagged. Houses went up for sale and sat empty for months. The town felt half-populated, as if everyone was holding their breath. Children who once played together now stayed indoors, warned by parents who refused to risk anything ever again. The police chief retired after 30 years of service. His replacement offered new energy, at least at first, promising to re-examine the case files with fresh eyes. He held one meeting with the families in the church basement that had been scrubbed and repainted but still smelled of damp. He thanked them for their patience and promised transparency. They nodded politely, but left before the coffee cooled. They had heard it before. They knew how these stories ended. No one wanted to admit it out loud, but they all knew there would be no more searches, no more helicopters, no more press conferences. There would only be waiting. The bitterness that had seeped into Dayton did not spare the families of the missing. In the early days, they had sat together in living rooms with maps spread across coffee tables, sharing lists of possible suspects and offering tissues when someone broke down. They had prayed side by side in church pews, clutching one another's hands with white knuckles, eyes closed tight as if faith alone might bring the children home. But over time, those shared moments began to fray. Grief wore them thin in different ways. Some wanted to keep searching, refusing to believe the children were gone forever. Others could not bear another false lead and began to speak of memorial services. Meetings grew tense, voices rising as accusations spilled out in exhausted bursts. Old friendships crumbled under the strain. Some stopped returning calls altogether, letting messages pile up unanswered on machines that beeped in empty kitchens. Even within individual families, the strain became too much to bear. Spouses who had once presented a united front found themselves sleeping in separate rooms, the space between them filled with unspoken blame. One father sat at the kitchen table night after night with his head in his hands, refusing to speak, except in hoarse whispers to the police when they bothered to call. A mother threw away all her daughter's clothes in a fit of rage, screaming that she could not stand to look at them anymore. Another couple quietly divorced after months of counseling sessions where neither could admit the truth. They both felt that they had grown to hate the way the other grieved. Children who had lost siblings retreated into themselves, staring blankly at homework assignments they could no longer finish, teachers sending notes home about failing grades that no one had the energy to address. In town, the division became plain to see. When the families did cross paths, they did so stiffly, offering curt nods that held none of the compassion of the early days. At vigils, the silence between them was not solemn respect, but an uneasy truce that threatened to shatter with every candle lit. Rumors circulated in whispers behind closed doors. Some said one family knew more than they let on, pointing to the way they had stopped attending meetings. Others noted who had moved away first, suggesting they were running from something rather than escaping the pain. The police tried to keep the peace at community events, their presence both comforting and resented. Volunteers who had once coordinated food drives and search parties now avoided each other in grocery store aisles, pushing carts quickly past shelves of canned goods and pretending to study labels. One father, Bill Hart, snapped during an interview with a local reporter who had asked him for the 100th time if he felt the police had done enough. He punched the man so hard he split his lip and broke 2 of his own fingers. He was arrested on the spot, his mugshot running on the front page the next morning, beneath a headline about rising tensions. His wife bailed him out in silence, refusing to look him in the eye as they drove home. Their house remained dark that evening. Except for the glow of the television, no one watched, tuned to static, because neither could find the energy to change the channel. Other parents watched the news with mixed feelings, some quietly agreeing with Bill's rage, others condemning it as proof the families had lost their way. Dayton was no longer a united front. It was a series of guarded camps, each convinced the others were doing something wrong. Church attendance continued to decline the sanctuary that had once held them all in grief, feeling like a place of betrayal. Some families refused to set foot inside, unable to forgive the pastor who had locked the side door, calling it a fatal mistake they could not forget. Others continued attending, but sat in the back, slipping out before the final hymn to avoid small talk with neighbors who stared too long or avoided their gaze altogether. The new pastor did his best to preach forgiveness and healing, but the words fell flat in the still air. The prayers for the missing children felt rehearsed and tired, like a school play, with lines everyone knew by heart but no longer believed. The offering plate came back lighter every week, the budget shrinking until the church board began discussing layoffs and selling the old van once used for youth trips. At a town hall meeting held in the high school gym meant to address falling tax revenue and school closures, the families showed up and sat in separate rows. When a council member suggested a memorial garden for the missing children to help the town move forward, the room erupted into shouts. One mother accused the council of wanting to bury the investigation alongside the flowers. Another parent yelled that they needed to let the children rest in peace. The moderator pounded his fist on the table to restore order, sweat soaking through his shirt as he pleaded for calm. The meeting ended early with no vote taken, the sound of folding chairs scraping against the floor as people filed out in grim silence. Outside the parking lot buzzed with heated arguments, some people crying, others cursing the cold air making each angry breath visible. When spring came, the change in weather brought no relief. The grass grew taller in unkempt yards. Mail piled up in boxes no one checked daily anymore. Children played less in front yards, their laughter replaced by the low drone of televisions behind closed curtains. The remaining flyers on utility poles curled and peeled away in the rain. Fundraisers once held to keep the search alive found no donors. A benefit dinner was canceled due to lack of interest. The church basement left empty except for rows of folding tables no one had bothered to set up. Even the police held fewer press conferences, their statements reduced to written releases emailed to newsrooms where they ran below the fold sharing space with petty thefts and bake sale announcements. 3 years after the children vanished, Dayton had grown quieter and more resigned, but the pain remained like an old scar that throbbed on cold mornings. The families had grown used to avoiding one another in public, but occasionally they would catch glimpses of familiar faces at the grocery store or gas station. They would lower their eyes quickly and pretend to read labels or fill tanks with unnecessary care. The town had tried to reclaim normalcy, but the word had lost meaning. Parents held their children's hands tightly at crosswalks. Teachers still checked locked doors twice before class. Strangers moving to town learned the story in hushed tones told over cups of burned coffee at diners that had lost half their regulars. Flyers were mostly gone, but in the corners of some windows the sun-faded images still stared out, haunting anyone who bothered to look. By the 4th anniversary, the search was no longer organized, but the woods around the church remained a magnet for those who refused to give up. Some of the parents had stopped looking, but a handful of volunteers still tramped through mud and dead leaves with old maps in hand. One man, a retired truck driver named Carl, who had no connection to the families, made it his mission to search every acre within 10 miles of the church. He moved slowly through the brush with a walking stick, pausing often to rest on logs and take long pulls from a battered thermos. People called him crazy behind his back, but no one stopped him. They only watched from their porches as he passed with a nod, his boots caked in mud and determination. It was Carl who found the clue no one had expected. In late November, after a heavy rain, he was picking his way along a dry creek bed that had only recently emptied. He noticed a scrap of fabric wedged between 2 rocks. It was small and dirty, but the pattern of tiny flowers was still visible through the grime. He picked it up, carefully turning it over in gloved hands, as he realized it matched the description of a dress one of the missing girls had been wearing that day. His heart thumped hard in his chest as he wrapped it in a plastic bag and marked the spot with orange tape. He hiked out as quickly as his old knees would allow and went straight to the sheriff's office. The deputy on duty took one look at the muddy bag and ran for his supervisor without another word. News of the discovery spread fast, reigniting all the fear and suspicion the town had tried to bury. The sheriff held a press conference the next day, standing in the gray drizzle in front of the courthouse. He explained that the fabric would be sent to the state lab for testing and that search teams would be reactivated to comb the area. Reporters who had not set foot in Dayton for years returned with camera crews, their vans blocking Main Street and their bright lights making the old buildings look tired and worn. Microphones were pushed into faces of parents who had spent years avoiding them. Some refused to speak, others wept openly. Rumors flared once more. People whispered about buried evidence, corrupt police, and killers who might be watching from the crowd even now. Volunteers gathered again, older now, but no less determined. They spread out in lines along the creek and nearby woods, their voices cracking as they called names they knew would not be answered. Police officers directed search dogs who sniffed the cold ground with professional detachment. Drones buzzed overhead, capturing footage of shivering men and women picking through leaf litter and soggy trash. They found nothing else of significance. A muddy sneaker turned out to be too large to belong to any of the children. A shallow depression in the soil was declared a fallen animal den. Each new disappointment felt like betrayal all over again, reopening wounds that had scabbed without ever truly healing. When the test results came back weeks later, they delivered a blow that nearly silenced the town for good. The lab could not confirm the fabric as belonging to any of the missing children. The pattern was common in discount stores that had sold thousands of dresses that year. No DNA could be lifted from the dirty fibers. The sheriff read the findings from a typed sheet in his office, his eyes dull and defeated. Reporters who had been so eager to film the renewed search packed up and left without fanfare, leaving behind scraps of paper and cold coffee cups on the courthouse lawn. The families went home without speaking to one another. For many, it was the last time they would participate in anything like a public search. The aftermath of the false hope settled like a stain no one could scrub away. Dayton had allowed itself to believe there might be an answer just around the corner. When that was taken away, the disappointment was worse than silence. People who had dared to feel compassion felt foolish and angry instead. Carl found himself shunned by neighbors who used to nod politely. No one thanked him for trying. He went back to walking the woods, a lone head bent the thermos at his side like a worn-out companion. He stopped visiting the diner where he had shared maps and theories, the regulars falling quiet whenever he walked in. Eventually, he left town altogether, leaving behind a small rented house with an overgrown yard and the old search maps rolled up in a trash can. The families responded in different ways. A few chose to double down on their private investigations, requesting old case files through formal channels and meeting with lawyers who specialized in cold cases. They spent savings meant for college tuition or home repairs to pay for private investigators who lasted only a few weeks before admitting there was nothing new to find. Other families withdrew entirely. They took down the last of the photos and boxed up clothes that had remained untouched for years. They stopped lighting candles on anniversaries. Friends and relatives who used to call weekly let months pass in silence, not knowing what to say anymore. The missing children's bedrooms were repurposed as guest rooms or offices, though the doors often remained closed. In town, the effect was cumulative. The grocery store cut its hours as sales dropped. A gas station closed and the building was boarded up. The church struggled to pay its heating bill through a long, brutal winter. The pastor held a meeting with the board about merging with another congregation in a neighboring town. Police morale fell even further, officers requesting transfers or early retirement. The new chief tried to boost spirits by talking about community engagement and rebuilding trust, but his words sounded empty even to him. He spent long nights at his desk with the cold case files spread around him, drinking bad coffee and reading the same lines over and over. As time pushed forward, and the false hope of the fabric clue faded into an awkward silence, the families of the missing children turned inward in painful and private ways. Angela Donnelly, who had once been the quietest at vigils, began to devote herself entirely to solving the case on her own. Her small living room slowly transformed into a cramped war room of maps, news clippings, and boxes of printed emails from amateur sleuths she had found online. Colored pushpins marked places the kids might have gone, red string stretched between theories that seemed increasingly desperate. Her husband avoided the room altogether, stepping carefully around the scattered papers on the floor as though they might bite. Their conversations over dinner became curt, full of frustrated sighs and forks scraping plates. Neither mentioned the way their eyes refused to meet. Angela was not the only one consumed by this private investigation. Bill Hart, who had once punched a reporter in public, turned his obsession into solitary drives. He quit his job at the local hardware store and spent days in his pickup truck rolling slowly past the edges of town, where farmland turned to wooded patches and abandoned buildings. He kept a notebook on the passenger seat with lists of people he wanted to question. He would sometimes park for hours outside old houses that looked empty but never were. On one occasion, a homeowner called the sheriff about the strange man in the truck staring at his yard. Bill left before a deputy arrived, but word spread fast. Former friends stopped waving at him on the road. They turned their eyes forward, pretending not to see the way his once trim beard had grown ragged. The police, aware of the family's private obsessions, began to treat them with a mix of pity and annoyance. The new chief received weekly calls from Angela, who had cataloged inconsistencies in the pastor's old statements and wanted to know why no one had checked the church records more carefully. She would leave long voicemails if he did not answer her voice, trembling with urgency and anger. He played them on speaker in his office as deputies shuffled uncomfortably and stared at their boots. Bill, for his part, tried to file a Freedom of Information request for documents already given to the families years before. When the clerk told him nothing new existed, he stood in the lobby muttering curses until he was asked to leave. The town had tried to move on, but these personal quests reminded everyone of what had never been solved. Neighbors complained quietly about Angela knocking on doors to ask if anyone remembered seeing something strange that day. She wore the same tired coat with papers stuffed in the pockets, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, as if she had forgotten the mirror. Children would ask their parents why Mrs. Donnelly was crying on the porch again. The parents would shush them and turn away eyes hard. One afternoon she posted hand-drawn flyers on the bulletin board at the grocery store, full of theories about the original search being botched. The manager took them down after complaints, folding them carefully and leaving them at her door without a word. The church had not escaped suspicion in Angela's eyes either. She discovered the previous pastor, the one who had locked the side door, had left town abruptly just months after the children went missing. She told anyone who would listen that it was too convenient. She dug up property records showing the man now lived 2 states away in a small rental house with no forwarding phone. The police confirmed they had spoken to him years earlier and found nothing, but Angela was not convinced. She tried to get the new pastor to talk about the old days, asking about bookkeeping irregularities and strange visitors who might have come to Sunday school. He listened politely at first, then asked her to leave and not return until she was ready to pray with him instead of interrogate him. Angela was also the one who found evidence of a mysterious payment from the church account a month before the children went missing. It was $12,000 paid in cash to a contractor whose business no longer existed. She demanded the church board explain it. They told her the old treasurer was dead, the records incomplete, and asked her to respect their grief too. She walked out of the meeting with her lips pressed tight, clutching the printout so hard her knuckles turned white. She photocopied it 12 times and mailed copies to the sheriff, the local newspaper, and even a regional crime podcast that never bothered to respond. Bill's approach was less subtle, but just as relentless. He began showing up at local bars and diners with his old notebook, asking if anyone remembered seeing a white van. When people grew tired of him, he would switch to demanding if anyone had checked the woods recently, as though he expected a confession over cheap coffee. Some owners banned him after too many tense arguments with customers. He began sleeping in his truck when his wife changed the locks on their house, refusing to watch him waste away in a mess of crumpled notes and half-spoken threats. He smelled of sweat and stale tobacco, his hair matted under a greasy cap. No one recognized the man who had once coached Little League and organized holiday parades. Their obsessions might have gone entirely unnoticed by outsiders, except for social media. Angela joined every missing persons forum she could find, posting theories late at night under multiple usernames. She shared photos of the evidence board in her living room, inviting strangers to weigh in. She begged podcasters to feature the case again, claiming the police had buried leads. Most ignored her or gently explained they needed new evidence. A few armchair detectives encouraged her, sending half-baked theories in return. Bill, for his part, used Facebook to accuse former friends of knowing more than they said, posting addresses and photos until the platform suspended him. He opened new accounts and continued undeterred. By the time another year passed, Angela's living room was impassable, stacks of files spilling onto chairs and the floor. She barely noticed the smell of mildew from papers left too close to the baseboard heater. Her husband spent evenings in the bedroom watching sports at low volume with the door shut. Bill's truck was seen less and less around town, sometimes parked on dirt roads for days before he moved it again. Local deputies would tap on his window and ask him to go home, but he would just nod and stare through them. He had nowhere else to go. As the 10th anniversary of the children's disappearance approached, the air in Dayton turned thick with old wounds and cautious silence. The town had learned to move around the topic like furniture in a dark room, careful not to bang shins against the truth. But the date approaching forced everyone to look again at what they had lost. Angela Donnelly watched the local news every evening, waiting for someone to mention it. The anchors read headlines about state budgets and school closings but avoided the old story until the last moment. When they finally aired a segment, it was short and somber, showing black and white photos of the 6 children, while the reporter stood in front of the boarded-up church, the wind flattening her hair. She closed with a polite request for anyone with information to come forward. Angela sat on the edge of her couch, clutching a cold cup of tea, yelling at the screen that they were doing it all wrong. Her husband stayed in the bedroom with the door shut tight. Plans were made for a memorial service at the church grounds, even though the building itself was condemned and slated for demolition within the year. Weeds had climbed the cracked walls, and the windows were so clouded with dust that no one could see the empty pews inside. The new pastor arranged folding chairs on the lawn and borrowed a microphone from the school. Flyers went up in grocery stores, and the city approved the use of the narrow street for overflow parking. Families of the missing children had to decide whether to show. Angela refused at first, telling anyone who would listen that it was an insult to hold a service without answers. But in the end, she came standing at the back in her wrinkled coat, arms crossed, scanning the crowd with sharp eyes. Bill Hart arrived late, stumbling from his truck with red-rimmed eyes, glaring at anyone who tried to approach. During the service, the pastor read from the Bible with a shaking voice. He talked about loss and faith and the importance of community, though many in the folding chairs stared at the ground. When he asked everyone to bow their heads, Angela kept hers raised, watching Bill instead. He did not close his eyes either, but turned in a slow circle as if searching for someone to blame among the mourners. Some people cried openly, wiping tears on sleeves or holding tightly to loved ones. Others sat stiffly, hands folded in their laps, determined not to show weakness. The local press stood at the edges with cameras zooming in on faces they recognized from old footage. When the pastor finished, the small crowd broke apart quickly, people mumbling awkward goodbyes or pretending to check phones. In the chaos afterward, a small commotion broke out near the makeshift altar. A mother screamed when she thought she saw her son in the crowd, a boy with the same haircut and nervous fidget. She pushed through chairs, calling his name in a strangled voice. The boy turned wide-eyed and shouted for his own mother, who came running from another row. There was a moment of tense silence before the mother of the missing child collapsed in sobs, shaking so hard 2 people had to carry her to a car. The service ended on that note of raw panic, the parking lot filling with the metallic clatter of doors slamming shut. Angela watched from the sidewalk, her jaw tight, convinced the press would twist the moment into spectacle. Bill sat on his truck tailgate, refusing to leave until the last camera crew packed up. Days later, the church door was vandalized with spray paint and thick red letters reading, "They are buried close." The pastor found it at dawn when he arrived to tidy the grounds, the paint still wet enough to drip onto the concrete. Police were called and took photos, bagging empty spray cans found in the grass. They questioned teenagers who denied everything and held meetings with the families to discuss whether it was a cruel prank or a threat. Angela insisted it was a message that someone knew the truth and had decided to mock them with it. The sheriff listened with a clenched jaw and gave another short press release promising to investigate. No arrests were made. The words were power-washed away before the next Sunday service, but the stain lingered faintly on the old wood. The families who had attended the memorial began fighting among themselves again almost immediately. Accusations flew in hushed phone calls and private Facebook groups about who had caused the scene with the boy mistaken for the missing child. Others blamed Angela for confronting reporters afterward and demanding they investigate the payment from the church account. Bill was seen sitting in his truck outside the vandalized church door for hours at a time, staring at the faded letters only he seemed to see. He muttered to himself, scribbling notes on receipts and old envelopes, occasionally slamming a fist against the steering wheel. The police tried to move him along politely at first, then issued a formal warning. He ignored it until they threatened arrest. He drove off in a roar of gravel that left dust hanging in the humid summer air. At the grocery store checkout line, people lowered their voices when certain parents walked by. Some whispered that it was shameful to keep rehashing old pain in public. Others claimed the families were making it worse for themselves by refusing to let go. The pastor tried to hold a healing service weeks later, but only a handful attended the hymns echoing hollow in the high ceiling. The collection plate came back nearly empty. One by one, families who had once been pillars of the congregation left for other churches or stopped attending altogether. The building felt more like a mausoleum than a sanctuary. The condemned sign on the door, a silent confirmation of what everyone already knew. School resumed in the fall with fewer students than ever, as more families left Dayton entirely. Teachers tried to focus on lessons, but older students whispered about the service and the screaming mother. Younger children asked why they could not have played on the church lawn anymore, and the staff told them it was unsafe without explaining why. Teenagers spray-painted jokes about ghosts on lockers and scribbled red letters on bathroom stalls. The principal suspended several for vandalism, but could not stop the rumors from spreading. Parents dreaded parent-teacher conferences where they knew someone would mention the missing children in hushed voices that trailed off awkwardly when they entered the room. By winter, Dayton felt more divided than ever. Neighbors who used to share snowblowers stopped making eye contact. The Christmas parade that once ran down Main Street was canceled because there were not enough volunteers to coordinate floats. Houses stayed dark except for a few strings of lights sagging under the weight of snow. On New Year's Eve, the only fireworks came from teenagers who lit them in empty parking lots, their pops and crackles sounding like gunfire across frozen fields. No one called the police. They simply turned up the volume on old movies and hoped the noise would stop. After the disastrous memorial service and the spray-painted warning on the church door, Dayton settled into a grim quiet that felt less like peace and more like surrender. Winter wrapped the town in cold silence, the snow deepening the sense of isolation that had taken hold in every neighborhood. Angela Donnelly spent most of her days inside the old evidence board in her living room, gathering a fine layer of dust as the furnace rattled in the background. She barely spoke to her husband, who had given up trying to make small talk over dinner. They ate silently at opposite ends of the table, the clink of silverware the only sound in the cramped space. The phone calls from the sheriff's office had stopped months earlier, and she stopped checking her voicemail after it filled with solicitations and wrong numbers. But the approach of the 15th anniversary stirred something restless in her. She began reading old news stories on her battered laptop, clicking through archived photos of search parties and police command tents. She noticed details she had missed before: small faces in crowds, mud on boots, a parked police cruiser at an odd angle. She printed out a dozen new images, pinning them up on the evidence board with shaking fingers. She pulled boxes off high shelves, papers slipping free and drifting across the floor like dry leaves. She stayed up late, squinting at documents in the glow of a single lamp, while her husband shut their bedroom door with a tired finality that did not even pretend to hide the sound. Angela decided she had to return to Dayton, though technically she had never truly left. She had moved to the outskirts with her husband in hopes of starting over, but she drove into town almost daily, circling familiar streets and peering into old yards that had changed owners 3 times since the children vanished. On the anniversary of the disappearance, she parked by the condemned church and got out, pulling her coat tight against the wind. The building looked worse than ever, windows boarded up and roof sagging under the weight of wet leaves. The grass had turned to mud where the town had held the last service folding chairs, leaving pale scars in the soil. Angela ignored the caution tape fluttering in the breeze. and walked around the side of the building, boots sinking with every step. Behind the church was a narrow band of woods that had been combed 100 times in those early days. Fallen branches littered the ground, and the underbrush had grown thick in the years since the last volunteer searcher had bothered to push through it. Angela picked her way slowly, one hand on the rough bark of trees to keep her balance. She remembered those first searches with painful clarity, the muffled sobs, the barking dogs, the shouted names. She had hated the woods ever since, but she refused to let that stop her. She moved carefully, stopping every few feet to look around, scanning for anything out of place. A fox darted through the brush and made her gasp, heart hammering, until it disappeared into the trees. She paused near a large oak tree she remembered from old maps, though it had grown much thicker over the years. Its trunk was deeply grooved and dark, with moisture, the roots snaking across the ground like frozen snakes. She felt drawn to it for reasons she could not explain. Leaning closer, she brushed away moss and dirt with a trembling hand. There, beneath the grime, she saw letters carved crudely into the bark, so weathered they were nearly invisible. She squinted and traced them with her fingers, mouthing the names as they slowly became clear. All 6 children, their names arranged in a rough circle as if they were still holding hands in death. Her breath caught in her throat and she jerked back, falling onto the cold ground. She stayed there for a long moment, staring up at the gray sky, too shocked to move. When Angela finally pushed herself up, she could barely feel her fingers. She took photos with her phone, her hands shaking so badly they came out blurry at first. She forced herself to focus, taking shot after shot until she was sure the letters were legible. She looked around wildly, half expecting to see someone watching from the trees, but she was alone. The wind picked up and blew dead leaves across the clearing, rattling branches overhead. She staggered back to her car, leaving deep tracks in the mud behind her. When she got inside, she locked the doors and sat panting, wiping tears from her cheeks with the back of her hand. Her phone buzzed with a low battery warning, but she ignored it, staring at the blurry photos in horror. Back home, she downloaded the photos to her computer, enlarging them until the pixels broke apart. The names were still there, unmistakable, even through the years of growth and decay. She printed them out and pinned them to the board, standing back to stare at them in grim satisfaction. This was proof not of who did it, but that someone had known enough to carve those names in secret. It was a message no one had noticed for 15 years, sitting in the woods just out of sight of the church. She wanted to call the sheriff immediately, but forced herself to wait to plan her words carefully. She knew how easy it was to be dismissed as emotional or unstable. She rehearsed her speech aloud in the quiet house, her voice cracking with rage and grief. Angela drove to the sheriff's office the next day, photos in a manila envelope clutched tight in her hand. The deputy at the desk greeted her with wary politeness, recognizing her immediately. She asked for the sheriff and sat on the hard plastic chair until he emerged from the back, sighing when he saw her. She did not let him speak. She handed him the envelope and told him to look. He opened it slowly, eyebrows drawing together as he studied the images. He asked where she had found them, and she told him in detail, voice shaking. He nodded and promised to send someone to see it to take new photos to document it properly. He asked her to stay available for more questions. She left the office, numb, unsure if he would keep that promise or file it away like everything else. The sheriff's office did not waste time after Angela's visit. Deputies arrived at the wooded lot behind the condemned church early the next morning, parking their trucks along the muddy lane where the ground was still marked by Angela's tire tracks. They stood in small groups with coffee in gloved hands, eyes fixed on the tree she had described. When the sheriff himself arrived, he ordered everyone to stay quiet, listening to the wind whistle through the bare branches. The tree loomed dark against the pale winter sky, its twisted roots curling above the dirt like bones. One deputy took photos from every angle, while another began scraping moss and bark away gently with a plastic tool. The carved letters emerged one by one, uneven but unmistakable. The names of the 6 missing children were arranged in a ragged ring, older cuts softened by time but still legible. The sheriff rubbed his forehead and turned away for a moment before calling in forensics. By midday, the crime scene tape fluttered around the site in bright lines that seemed obscene in the quiet woods. News of the discovery spread through town like a grass fire in dry heat. People who had not spoken of the children in years found themselves whispering about the carved names, their voices trembling with both horror and relief. Some claimed they had always suspected the truth lay somewhere close by, though they had never searched those exact trees. Others blamed the police for not finding it sooner, insisting the entire area should have been stripped to the roots 15 years ago. Parents who had tried to move on found themselves weeping in kitchens, wiping tears on dish towels while the TV showed blurry cell phone footage of deputies working in the cold. The press arrived with cameras and long lenses climbing over frozen brush to get their shots, while deputies shouted at them to keep their distance. The forensic team began work immediately, setting up tents and portable lights that glowed dull yellow in the gray afternoon. They dug carefully around the roots of the oak, removing wet earth in slow-measured scoops. Reporters speculated breathlessly about what might be buried below. Volunteers from the early search parties watched from the perimeter, their faces pale as old paper. Angela stood behind the tape with her coat pulled tight, eyes fixed on the ground where they worked. She did not speak to the reporters who recognized her, only shook her head when they asked for comment. Bill Hart arrived late, stumbling over roots and pushing through the crowd until deputies stopped him with firm hands. He shouted at them to let him see, to tell him if they had found anything yet, before falling to his knees and sobbing in the wet leaves. By evening, they uncovered a small metal box wedged under the roots, corroded almost to collapse. The lead investigator knelt beside it for a long moment before signaling for photos. When they pried it open, they found 6 small bundles of clothing wrapped in plastic, the fabric brittle with age and damp. Each bundle was labeled with the faded masking tape initials written in black marker that had bled and blurred over the years but still matched the missing children. The smell that escaped when the box opened was sour and old, like rotted cloth and wet dirt. Forensics took samples of everything, bagging it with slow precision. A deputy turned and vomited quietly behind a tree. The sheriff watched without speaking, his breath white in the freezing air. He radioed for additional help, voice cracking as he gave the coordinates. The search did not stop there. Encouraged by the find team spread out in careful grids around the oak. They used ground-penetrating radar to scan the earth while others probed gently with metal rods. Just before dark, the dogs began to bark and circle a patch 20 feet from the tree. Deputies moved in, marking the area with flags, while the sheriff ordered lights to be set up. They worked into the night breath, steaming as they cleared frozen leaves and dug through thick mud. They found bone fragments, small and delicate, mixed with the roots of an old bush. Forensics worked silently, placing each piece in labeled bags with gloved hands. A medical examiner on site shook her head when he asked for details, explaining they would need lab work to confirm anything. But the sheriff knew what they had found. He turned to look at Angela, who was still standing by the tape, her eyes reflecting the harsh glow of the work lights. She did not cry, but her hands shook violently. The town reacted with a numb sort of horror. The news broadcast that night led with photos of the taped-off site, the oak tree lit up like something from a nightmare. Commentators speculated about what kind of person could do such a thing, carving the names as a twisted monument to their crime. Old accusations flared back to life. People asked why the pastor had locked the side door that day, why the first searches had skipped certain areas, why the church had paid thousands in cash to an unknown contractor. Families who had managed to avoid each other for years found themselves sitting across grim tables again, comparing notes, rehashing every detail. Some wanted to organize new searches, even as the sheriff begged them to stay away and let professionals handle it. The grocery store shelves filled with newspapers carrying headlines about the grisly discovery. No one smiled at the checkout line. Neighbors barely spoke. Angela went home that night with the photos of the tree still on her phone, lying awake in the dark, listening to the wind rattle the old windows. Her husband slept fitfully beside her, mumbling in dreams. She stared at the ceiling until dawn, her mind racing through theories and memories, every possibility turning over in her head like sharp stones. She wondered if the person who carved the names had watched them search all those years ago. She wondered if they had stood behind a tree and laughed or cried. She imagined hands pressing the knife into the bark, spelling out each name with hateful precision. She vowed she would not stop until she knew who those hands belonged to. She told herself she would burn the entire town down to get the truth if she had to. When the investigation resumed in earnest, the sheriff's department worked with a grim intensity that had been missing for years. The state police sent specialists in cold cases who set up shop in the old courthouse annex. Boxes of evidence that had gathered dust were spread across folding tables under buzzing fluorescent lights. Photographs of the children in bright Sunday clothes sat alongside new images of the carved oak and the battered metal box with its heartbreaking contents. Deputies worked long hours comparing old maps to recent aerial surveys. Some had tears in their eyes as they reviewed the records of search patterns that had somehow missed the crucial tree so many times. There was no press conference at first. The sheriff ordered silence from his staff and refused every interview request. Inside the annex, though, his voice was raw as he demanded to know how they had failed so badly. He listened to explanations that sounded like excuses and slammed his hand on the table so hard the evidence boxes rattled. Word spread quickly anyway because nothing in Dayton stayed secret for long. The local newspaper ran editorials demanding accountability for the failures of the initial investigation. One column named specific officers who had retired comfortably in other towns. Another pointed out that the church leadership at the time had never explained the cash payment to the phantom contractor. Neighbors turned on one another again at backyard fences and church coffee hours with hushed arguments about who should have searched harder or paid more attention. Even the grocery store manager was overheard telling a vendor that the entire town had blood on its hands for not pushing the police harder. The pastor tried to hold a meeting in the cold basement of the neighboring Methodist church after their own building was closed for good, but barely a dozen people showed up. They sat scattered on metal chairs, unable to make eye contact while he prayed for forgiveness that felt too late and too thin to cover anything. Meanwhile, the families were left to grapple with the certainty that their children were dead, and had been dead all along. Angela Donnelly spent entire days at the sheriff's annex, sitting with investigators, answering the same questions she had forced them to consider for years. She handed over her boxes of maps and notes without hesitation, though her hands trembled as she did so. Her husband drove her there every morning in silence and picked her up every evening without asking what she had learned. Their marriage had been reduced to a careful truce built on shared pain. Angela slept poorly, waking often in the dark, reaching for the stack of papers on her nightstand, as if checking to be sure the evidence was still there. She ate only when forced, and never smiled. When the sheriff asked why she had kept pushing when everyone else had given up, she looked at him with eyes that seemed older than her face, and told him because they were mine, even if no one else remembered. Bill Hart was not welcome at the annex, but he lingered outside most days in his truck parked along the curb with the engine running to stay warm. He watched investigators come and go, sometimes screaming curses at them through the window, other times pressing his forehead to the steering wheel and sobbing so hard the entire truck shook. Deputies tried to talk him into going home, but he refused, pretending not to hear them. He had nowhere else to be, and nothing left to lose. He had sold his house for almost nothing and lived out of motels where the owners tolerated him because he always paid cash up front. He kept his old notebook on the passenger seat pages, torn and dirty from years of use. At night, he would park by the condemned church with the lights off, staring at the black silhouette of the steeple against the stars, whispering his children's names until he fell asleep. The forensic reports eventually confirmed what everyone feared but needed to hear. The remains found in the dirt belonged to at least 4 of the 6 missing children. The fragments were too degraded for complete identification, but the lab was confident enough to make the call. The clothes in the box matched what parents remembered dressing their kids in that morning for Sunday school. The initials on the old masking tape matched the children's first names. The medical examiner said the bodies had been there for years, maybe from the very beginning, but could not determine exact causes of death. That absence of certainty only fed the town's worst suspicions. The sheriff finally held a press conference standing before a forest of microphones with his hat in his hands, voice breaking as he apologized for the failure to find them sooner. He promised they would keep looking for whoever had done it, but even he sounded unconvinced. The town watched the broadcast in living rooms where the curtains were drawn tight and no one spoke when it ended. Funerals were planned for the first time. Not just candlelight vigils or somber church services with empty coffins, but actual burials. The families chose to share a single plot in the town cemetery where 6 headstones would stand in a circle like children holding hands. The monument was paid for with donations from across the state, many from strangers who had watched the story unfold over the years. The service was held on a cold spring morning with wind rattling the floral arrangements that ringed the fresh dirt. Parents stood shoulder to shoulder, some leaning on canes or walkers after so many years of waiting. Angela wore a plain black coat, her hair pinned back severely, her face pale and exhausted. Bill stood apart at the edge of the crowd, hands jammed into his pockets, eyes fixed on the ground as though daring it to open and swallow him too. The pastor read from the Bible in a steady voice, and for once, no one interrupted or walked away. When it was over, the town felt strangely quiet, as if everyone was too tired to argue anymore. The old divisions remained, but they no longer seemed worth fighting over. People still avoided eye contact at the grocery store, but they held the door open for each other without words. The pastor kept the church closed and eventually sold the property to the town, which promised to tear it down and replace it with a small park. The tree with the carved names was cut down, but the stump was saved and installed in the local history museum, where school children would be brought to see it and learn what had happened. The sheriff retired before the year was out, citing health reasons, and the new chief was a woman from a neighboring county who promised transparency but rarely spoke to reporters. Angela moved away with her husband to a small apartment in a nearby city where no one recognized them. Bill eventually stopped showing up at the cemetery, and no one could say for sure where he had gone. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss future narratives. We would love to hear your thoughts about the plot and where you are watching from, so leave a comment below and join the conversation.